2023. The topic of conversation today is generally the Port of Alaska. We have a handful of ordinances and substitute versions before us. We have AO 2023-34, an ordinance authorizing and approving the adoption of a Port of Alaska terminal tariff number 10. And we also have AO 2023-60, 2023-60S, 2023-60S1, and there's probably even a 2023-60S2 circling out in the ether, waiting to come down. And that one is an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly approving the basis of design concept submitted by the Port of Alaska Modernization Program and Design Advisory Board that will govern the Phase 2 modified concept for the Port of Alaska general purpose cargo terminals. We'll do introductions, please.
Zach Johnson.
Anna Brawley.
Daniel Bolland.
Scott Myers.
Meg Zalato.
Christopher Constant, and appears on the phone. We have Mr. Rivera, Ms. Bronga, Mr. Presverdia.
Yeah, Kevin Presverdia.
We also have Matthew Hurt and Dean Gates from Assembly Council and Legislative Council's office. And then we have from the port,
Eric Adams, Jacobs Engineering Program Manager for the PAMP program.
Steve Rebuffo, Port Director.
John Daly, Port of Alaska Engineering.
all right. So we have a number of other people in the room and an interesting topic. I think the first thing I'm going to do is pivot to Ms. Alatel.
Thank you, Chair Constant. So we've had 2 work sessions. This is the third. What we're really trying to do is drive towards decision. These items are before us on the 25th. I created a chart. You'll have a chart before you. Call it a decision matrix if you want to be fancy. And it deals with both the tariff and the design. And I'm going to walk us through this because, frankly, I felt like I was stymied in this decision, particularly around the tariff, because I felt like it was being presented as a binary option to us, either vote yes or vote no. And as I really thought about what all the options are, I put them into a chart. So I kind of wanted to walk through those. The first is if we just want to continue with the current tariff, which continues port operations, we would vote no on the proposed AO 2023-34. If we want to adopt a uniform tariff, basically, we have to authorize a surcharge because there's $19 million in restructured petroleum and cement terminal debt that goes along with that. And we still get continuation of port operations. So what you'll see is as I go through these is that it's cumulative. Then we have the option. So we do have the option of just doing that. We have the option of doing that plus saying, we are adopting the surcharge concept as a dedicated financing mechanism to pursue a TIFIA loan. So that way the port has that commitment from us for purposes of their application to go pursue that federal financing for the cargo terminals. It doesn't mean that we've authorized the surcharge specific because we wouldn't have the financial details until we knew the terms of the loan and the amount of the loan if it were to be approved. And then finally, we have the last box row there is what is proposed in 2023-34. Although I think language around allowing a surcharge as a dedicated mechanism isn't quite as strong as it could be even in the ordinance. And so that might want to be added, but then you would just vote yes on the proposed ordinance. So I wanted to lay those out because I think it gets confusing along the way when we switch from the current tariff to the uniform tariff and then the different ways in which the surcharge could be allowed. And in speaking with the port, what I think is also really important to keep in mind, while under the current AO, the $65 million in revenue bonds along with the $19 million in restructured PCT debt are combined to create a surcharge. In the future, we may have multiple cumulative surcharges. And we really haven't talked about that. We may have surcharge 1, surcharge 2, surcharge 3 over time. And I think that that's an important aspect that I didn't get until I kind of broke out these options. Switching to design, which is on the back, we have a lot of versions before us, but basically they boil down to the design advisory board approved design, the intermediate option, and then the previously approved option, which wouldn't require any action by us. But I think there's a compromise option that's been talked about a couple of times.
Thank you.
And so the compromise option, as I see it, is the design advisory board design for Terminal 1, and then asking for two designs to be created for Terminal 2, which is the intermediate design, as well as the design advisory board proposed design. And this comes out of the conversation we've had at work session to say, hey, what's the cost differential at a relatively high degree of certainty between these two designs? What's the economic benefit of the difference between the two? And frankly, what I would hope to see, and I plan to bring a version that does this, is to say, hey, what we want really listed out is what does the Port of Alaska need? And then what is everything else, so that we have a menu before us when it comes time to approve a design to move it to construction, because that's where the rubber is going to meet the road on cost and actually what we're selecting. So I think only a couple other things. Sorry to bounce back and forth. The CFO was generous enough, acting CFO was generous enough to run the numbers on if we just authorize a surcharge for the $19 million in restructured PCT debt. So if you want to know about that. And I think that is really kind of where I'm at. I guess I have one question, and it is around the surcharge, which is, when we approve this concept, if we approve this surcharge concept, how flexible is it? And this is the question. So a uniform tariff, it's uniformly applied. We have a surcharge. So we have surcharge 1, let's just say for the $19 million in restructured PCT debt. And then we're going to have surcharge 2. Let's say we get that TIFIA loan. Great. And then let's say there is a user requirement that they want something on their dock that the port doesn't necessarily need or want. Can that surcharge concept only apply like as a subset to that user to finance that, or would that user just pay for that thing that they wanted that the port doesn't necessarily want?
Well, I'll give you my recommendation for how to handle
Mr.
that,
Rebuffo.
because you can really do it any way you want. But that's when you suggested that you would like to see what it is that the port believes it needs, you know, that once we're in agreement with that should be established as the baseline. Anything other than what is in the baseline that leans towards the proprietary use of it by any particular user on the port, then that should be paid for by that particular user that wants that extra added capability. And we've done that before. And it's been, so there's precedent for having done things that way. And I think that's probably the most reasonable way to go. If it's the generic basic design for the port that we believe is going to satisfy all the requirements as we understand them to be for the next 50 or 75 years, that's the baseline. Above that should be what a user, if the user wants that, then the user should pay for it, whether it's a current user or somebody that comes later and wants to handle things that way.
Mr. Chair, with that, I think we should discuss what the options are before us, see if there is any direction possibly, or if we need any additional documents prepared for Tuesday night. It's really my hope that we can be in a position on Tuesday night to move towards decision. Feels like we've been doing this nonstop for a couple of months.
So I have a question that I want to ask to refine your question. So Steve, you just said that anything proprietary use should be paid for by the user. So the question that I have on that is, out of their own cash, or is that something that an additional tariff could be levied specific to their operation?
Either or, quite frankly.
Right.
What we've done in the past, and I'll give you the two examples that I know of. One of them is the gantry cranes. This goes back pre-Matson. This goes back pre-Horizon Lines. when that was first undertaken. The cranes were specific to the need of that particular user. The city or the municipality, because it could get a better bond rating for purchase of the cranes, we arranged for the purchasing of the cranes, and the user paid the bond off. That was the contractual arrangement that the city made with that particular cargo user. And we've heard, Totes mentioned this before, but when they changed out from their Ponzi class vessels to the Orcas, there was a requirement for a third ramp and a third trestle. A similar arrangement was made for how that would be financed. And there's a bond in place, and Tote in this case is paying off the bond. And when everything is finished, the property reverts to the municipalities. Worked very closely with the municipal attorney's office to make sure we crafted those arrangements so that they were fair and equitable to everybody. So we can do it that way, or you can do it in the tariff. But I would suggest that in the tariff, specific stuff like that in a tariff that doesn't apply to anybody else who would pick it up and read it and come to the port is probably not the right way to do it, but it is a way to do it if we want to.
Yeah, just let me restate though. So what I heard you say is they could pay for it. You could pay for it with some terms of the loan that they are in agreement to pay service on over time, and you would own it in the end, or this tariff, which would not be the favored way.
Right.
Those are the three kind of general options.
That's what I see it. Yes.
Okay, Ms. Alito.
Thank you. Just to put even finer point on that, if we financed it and they paid back, are you saying that would operate outside of the tariff and surcharge concept? It would be more of a contractual arrangement?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that's, some folks might think that's a little wonky, but that's very good information. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first I'll say I'm interested in the discussion because I know we are trying to figure this out, and I'm very interested in making a decision on this. So I appreciate Member Zalatel's work and looking forward to that discussion. But my question in the meantime, it's on the design because I know we've had multiple numbers thrown around, and I know that some of them do have cost implications. So I just want to understand, or at least ask the question, when we're talking about the uniform dock face, what is the width or the depth of that dock? Because we've heard 120 feet. We've heard, I think, something prior to that. We've heard 134 feet. So I just want to be clear. And then a question is, what is the cost implication of that?
I'm going to phone my engineering friend to handle the details on the engineering question.
Through the chair, assembly person, Brawley, the width of the T1 dock right now is proposed as underneath the designer of record is doing is 120 feet by 870 feet long. When you talk about the uniform dock face going forward, it would currently is proposed is 69 feet wide, 938 feet long.
Okay. And so just to be clear, so currently none of the official designs state 134 feet. Is that correct?
None of the designs that are moving forward are 134 feet at this time. The max width is 120.
Okay, thank you. And then one additional question on the design. I understand we're partway through the permitting process, and as I understand that is one of the biggest potential risks or factors in terms of timing, that if we have to redo our permits, that would set our schedule back significantly. So just to ask again, are any of the current designs, such as those represented in these AOs, are those contemplated as fitting within that permit application, or would there need to be changes to it?
Currently, the permit applications, we anticipate this might be happening, and so we permitted for worst case scenario 120 foot wide for both T1 and T2, just in case if this decision was made that we do want to go forward with on T2.
Thank you.
I can say that decision, I don't think we were briefed on that. And it could have been perceived as a very bad thing, meaning it looked like the port opted to permit the dock that they wanted, not the dock that they were approved for. But Mr. Owens was able to communicate the rationale in a way that made it less kind of hostile to the process and more kind of the idea of being prepared for any scenario, right? One permitting process prepared for any scenario. I think in the future, it might be well received to have those kinds of decisions briefed so that it doesn't come as a surprise on the back end that we have a different permit than we have a design. So that's just a bit of subtle diplomacy. So I have a question though. The width question was very interesting. 120 by 870. Which design is that?
Assembly Chair Constant, that would be the intermediate option and for T1, and also the DAB approved option for on Assembly Person Zawatel's list here for DAB approved, from dock face.
And so the uniform dock is narrower and longer.
T1 is 120 feet wide by 870 feet long. The option for T2 right now is 69 feet wide,
I see.
938 feet long.
Okay, understood. Thanks. Helpful. Ms. Alatel.
So I have a couple of additional financing questions. One is about the structure of the option for the TIFIA loan. Do we have to be to a certain design percentage before we could start that process? Or could we get that process going and then we would just ultimately submit, a shovel-ready project at like 65% design?
I'm kind of hoping Ross is on the phone because
Yes.
I don't know the specifics on that, but I don't believe there's a specific percent design that you have to meet in order to get serious consideration by TIFIA. I think where we are conceptually is good enough, but I'm not certain about that, and I'm happy to go find out if it can't get it answered right now.
Mr. Risvold, you on the phone?
Mr. Constant, Mr. Hunt, and Steve, that's a good summary. We haven't heard anything about the design percent with regard to our discussions so far with the DOT people. So what we've presented to them in our letter of interest so far is the design that is in place at this time. And should it change, we will certainly take the appropriate action.
Thank you. That's helpful. Partly just if this is the route the body chooses to go and wants to explicitly say, hey, we like the surcharge concept for this financing option, I feel like time is of the essence. Why would we wait to pursue that? And then the follow-up question, and this might actually have to be referred to council, and I realize Mr. Owens is out for 2 weeks, but the TIFIA financing mechanism precludes us from getting certain other federal grants. It says if we're going to loan you this money, you can't also seek this other federal grant funding. There's some limitations. It's not blanket, but there's some. And I'm really curious, and I would want to make sure that there isn't an intersection where there's a prohibition on us getting our MURAD settlement money. So I see Ben Bowman nodding his head so he can go check that out. But I think that's just really important since there is already somewhat of a federal restriction in the TIFIA program that it wouldn't apply to our settlement money. Thanks.
I'll practice law without a license. I think it's an apple and an orange, but to your point, you never know. It's worth checking out.
Well, I actually am going to jump in, think that there might be then a rationale for waiting on the TIFIA process as opposed to diving right in. If there are federal grants that are available that are within our wheelhouse, then maybe we should secure the grants first. And so I would love to understand the timelines, the relative timelines. And so, but maybe those grant programs aren't ones we would generally apply for anyways. I don't know. And so would it also include the congressionally designated spending or other pools of money? So that's an interesting question. And again, it doesn't change my value that we should seek the cheapest money we can get, the most cost-effective money. It's just the timing might be important. So,
Mr. Constant?
yep, go ahead, Mr. Iswell. Yep.
Yes, thank you, and pardon the interruption. We have our municipal advisor, Steve Cantor, on the phone, and he will be happy to address that concept and question that was just cited as briefly as you can. Mr. Cantor, are you available?
Yes, sir, and through the chair, Mr. Thompson. The TIFIA loan is limited to 1/3 of the project. We have identified with the TIFIA people grants that the Port of Alaska has already received, and the more grants that we get from the federal government, the happier the TIFIA people are. So I would think that we should continue applying for the grants contemporaneously with the TIFIA process, and not the way one to the other.
Ms. Zalato.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarity, Mr. Cantor. Are we considered a mega project, which I was reading could allow us possibly to seek up to 49% of the project's funding needs?
As of, through the chair, Ms. Aguilar, as of now, we are not designated a mega project, and so we are limited to 1/3 of the project cost.
Thank you.
That, of course, raises the question,
How do you get?
what's the step? Because in Alaska terms, this is a mega project.
I think it's fair to pursue finding out exactly what it would take to get the designation.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a softball. So, okay, now I guess we can pivot to briefly the port giving their 2 cents, or please. Yep.
So I just want members to be aware that it's my intention to make sure that there are items before us on Tuesday night on the tariff chart that conform with row number 3, and on the design chart that conforms also with row number 3. Those are my preferences. I feel like that puts us into a design certainty with a menu of options and a cost evaluation on design, and it doesn't slow anything down with regard to Terminal 1, which we're trying to drive towards construction. And similarly, it lets us move into the uniform tariff, restructure the petroleum cement terminal debt, which is required if we move into the uniform tariff, and really expresses our will to have this TIFIA loan pursued. This is really inexpensive money, and it certainly it seems cheaper than issuing revenue bonds. It doesn't preclude the issue of revenue bonds later if they're needed, but I'm in favor of the cheapest money we can get to move forward before we seek more expensive funding sources. Thank you.
Question, Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, this is a question for members Zalato. So looking at the design, you mentioned row 3, the compromise option. So I guess my question is your intent to say we're still going to have 2 options for the design? Because I hear the urgency about moving forward with Terminal 1, but I also am just really concerned about kicking that can down the road, because that's partly why we're in the situation we're in, is that we've been making serial decisions, it feels like, or there's been, I guess at some point soon, very soon, I would like a final decision on what Terminal 2 looks like. So I just wonder what your thinking is
I
there.
somewhat disagree, because we're pushing towards Terminal 1 construction in 2025, summer 2025. We kind of have like a deadline, and Terminal 2 will follow. It won't likely go under construction at the same time as Terminal 1. And my understanding is design is going to move rather quickly once we take this action, like close to 65%, particularly around Terminal 1 by December is the projected timeline. So I don't see this slowing it down, because frankly, both were already contemplated, but we can get close enough on or high enough design certainty so that we can actually get some firmer numbers as you know, at a 30% design, the plus and minus on the cost is still, around 30. And that's a lot of money when we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, and I hear that, and certainly don't want to delay Terminal 1. I guess the way I'm thinking about it is, we're going into this without a pre-decided or predetermined master plan for the port and what it needs to look like and how much our need is. And so I'm open to the idea that we would delay that decision, because it does seem important to have more information about it. But I'm also just concerned that that's been the focus of the conflict or disagreement, and so that's just going to continue for a few months as we have multiple stakeholders that have different ideas about it. And so I guess that's where I'm getting at, is just I would like that question settled soon, and I understand we need information for that.
I guess I would offer, if you have a different idea, to bring another version Tuesday night and we can debate them.
And I'll jump in there and just say the purpose of the two designs coming to us at the same time for the second terminal is we can make a database decision. We can have a cost benefit analysis for whether it's a larger scale project or a narrower scale project, what the costs are. I think we can actually make a deliberative decision when we get there. So I'm hopeful at least to see that item. And that raises the question to Steve. What are your thoughts?
I've had an opportunity to put a lot of time into thinking about how Meg is crafting this for execution. And I have to agree that the immediate matter at hand is getting your approval to officially proceed on Terminal 1. And the rest, we can certainly take a breath, step back, and give you the level of detail that you're looking for to make a more informed decision on whether, what's the cost benefit of all the different options. Is the risk worth taking to wait on some things that we would prefer to be done more immediately? Those can be conversations for another day, and it won't affect the timeline. So with respect to what you might be proposing as a decision on the basis of design, if you want to bifurcate Terminal 1 from Terminal 2 and give us the true green light on Terminal 1, that's an acceptable way to go in the short run here.
So when you say bifurcate them, I imagine a document that doesn't bifurcate, but it approaches both at the same time. What it says is proceed with Terminal 1 and proceed with design for Terminal 2, but give us both designs, the intermediate design and all the bells and whistles design in the next phase.
No, that's acceptable.
Right.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be a bifurcation.
Okay, but I think Mr. Adams wants to interject a little bit.
Yeah, that's trying to restate that because you said bifurcate, and I don't think that's what we're talking about.
Okay.
Chair Constant, continuing two designs on T2 for the intermediate width and then the 69 and 120. My recommendation would be when we get the 65% design done in December, we're going to get a cost update from that, and then we can use that data to extrapolate the cost for the 69-foot wide and to the 120. So we don't need to advance the T2 design immediately. We can wait until December and then in January put that out for bid based on those numbers we provide you guys in December.
So to me, that seems pretty darn reasonable. The question that I have, I think this gets to a point Ms. Brawley has made a few times, is separate from or notwithstanding a master planning process, because I don't necessarily think we have the time or need to do that. I have had some discussions with Ms. Zalatel about the idea of doing some need analysis, some future growth analysis, so that when we get to the point when we have the designs and we have kind of the decision point coming, we also have some analysis that's been done to demonstrate what we project the demand is in real terms, not in like the biggest of all possible terms. And so I don't know what that would look like. It's like a modified mini master plan of some kind that just looks at growth curves and potentials and who are the customers and who would pay for that over time. Is that something we could build into this somehow?
Well, we can always undertake that kind of an economic analysis under a separate RFP and attempt our best to time it so that when we have the two designs to look at, we have this to look at with it. We can certainly undertake that effort, and it's probably not a bad idea to do it. I know it's been a while since we've actually asked somebody to put that on paper for us.
I think if we have those two parts, which is the two costs for the design concepts and then the projection of growth, that's in terms that we can all generally agree on, then we have all the points we need to make an informed decision.
Okay, and I just want to make one more point of clarification, if it's okay. And I hope I'm not the only person in the world that thinks this way, but when I talk about master planning is all about infrastructure. What we are doing here is undertaking a master planning effort because we are trying to determine what the infrastructure for the port should best look like. That is the master plan part of the effort here. A strategic plan is putting that in with, what the business needs going forward are. This need analysis thing is a perfect example. If I do this now, then when I put my RFP for the strategic plan on the street, this document can inform that, and will cost us, we'll pay for it one way or the other. Doing it more immediately, it's not going to be dated by the time we get around to doing a total full-up strategic plan. So that's that's a reasonable request, and we can certainly do that.
So if we get there, then I would appreciate that document going through the various boards, your commission, the design advisory board. So it comes through a process everyone generally has a buy-in for. Mr. Bond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so definitely the treating this as infrastructure is an important concept. And I guess I'll just say, for myself, where I'm inclined currently is to support the intermediate option. And the projected or the growth projections or the need analysis, I think if that work is done, I will still take it with a big grain of salt. Because I think often when it comes to transportation and infrastructure related projections, they are often overly optimistic in terms of things like population growth, and they drive towards scope creep. I think a good analogy for us today is that the STIP is up for public comment. And we've done a lot of work around, the assembly around the Seward Highway O'Malley to Diamond reconstruction project, which is still on the tip. And we've asked for, it to be reimagined. We've asked for reanalysis because those projections that were originally done in 2006 projected increased traffic demand counts and increased population growth. And what we've seen is the exact opposite of those projections happen. And I guess I'm really worried. What we're trying to do, what we need to do is replace the port. And so we can ensure a functional port going forward. But I think I am concerned that we are potentially moving in a direction of overbuilding and not just replacing, but potentially increasing capacity beyond what we need. And those cost considerations too, I think are concerning. Thanks.
May I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I'm going to violently agree with Member Voland on that. And because I have that concern all the time. And I've seen enough of these kinds of things done to agree with you that we are overly optimistic when the reality, and we see the evidence every single day, every single year. Volumes aren't growing. They're predictable because we support a population that isn't growing. This port is from the commerce mission side of this port. It's all about the probably 700,000 Alaskans that get support out of it, who all only eat so much, go buy new clothes so often, put gas in their car tanks once a week, buy a new car every 10 years. You can forecast that demand on the back of a napkin. That part of it is very predictable. What we don't know is what the resource development industry, mining and all of that is going to do to us. But we do know that when that does something to us, it doesn't do it to us forever. It does it to us for a finite period of time. So how much port do you want to build? And I look at the one we have now, and we're at 40% capacity. 5 days a week, I look out the window and nothing's happening because you don't need any more than what we've got now to support the size of this population. And what we're building is just a newer version with even a little bit less dock, because we see that coming. And it seems very impractical to overbuild in that respect. So we're very conscious of that. And maybe what this document will do is validate that for us.
Please.
John Daly through the chair. One thing I want to just point out is implementation of what you're asking for. So right now, the designer of record is under the gun with a lot of demands. and they're supposed to be producing a 65% design somewhere near the end of the year. They're barely able to do that. It's a big job. So I'm just trying to clarify, and if we were to ask them to now produce a 65% design of 2 more options for Terminal 2, it would break them at this point. So it would have to be, their timing has to be considered, and they do have, so our contract with them is for Terminal 1 with the option to include Terminal 2. And I talked to Bob Owen about this a little bit. You should bear in mind that there's some sort of Lego block-like attributes to this. Once they design Terminal 1, it would be very similar to Terminal 2, and they could extrapolate costs at a fairly high level. I'm just pointing out the timing and what we're going to ask people to do. If you're expecting something very soon, it's difficult.
I just want to clarify. I don't think there's an idea of needing 2 more designs. It would just be 1. And what I understand is 1 additional. And if you look at the third option on the design side, it's the first option, DAB for Terminal 1. And so that would be uniform across any of the docks. And then it would be for the second dock, both the one that they were going to develop and the intermediate design just for that second half. And so it wouldn't be 2 additional. It would really be 1/4 of an additional, or half, if you will, of the overall. And so, but I would recognize it might take a bit more time and money even. But that's just the reality of this work. A short-term front-end investment could make sure we spend in the long term the right amount, just the right amount. So, Ms. Zalatil.
Yeah, what you said about the extrapolation makes perfect sense. It's just we want to do it with a high enough degree of certainty that we aren't plus or minus 30% or more on what the costs differences are, because at that point we're kind of still guessing. We got to get in the ballpark. Thanks.
Anyone else? Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thank you. And again, I just want to state really clear. So I am fine with looking at 2 different designs as long as we can do that in a timely fashion. And I hear the point about, consultants only have so much capacity, right? But I think it's really important that we have a clear story and a justification for what this port's going to look like in the future. And that's ultimately, I think, because that seems to be what's been in flux, not Terminal 1, but Terminal 2. And then that impacts basically the story about the whole port. And so, again, that's why I'm interested in making sure that we make that decision, making sure that it's informed. And I know that it has taken a long time and we need to get it right. But again, just to make sure, because that makes a more compelling and justifiable story to other funders, including grant applications, speaking with elected officials, all of those things. And it also, indicates that Anchorage knows what it's doing, because I know that we have a history, unfortunately, and I'm not speaking to folks sitting in this room right now but the stabilization, but the perception from outside parties, as I think we all know, is that there's concern about if we give Anchorage more money, what will they manage it properly? And so that's what I'm looking at and thinking ahead to next legislative session, to speaking with congressional folks and being able to tell that story. So again, I just want to lay out, and I know we're all aware of that, but I just want to make it really clear. And then my specific question is, if there's an economic analysis done, I think that's important. How much would it cost, and is that something that would come out of the port's budget because you guys are an enterprise function, or is that something that the assembly would need to appropriate?
I'll guess, because you don't know until you put an RFP out and you get the proposals back. But this looks like something that'll be in around the $120,000 range, probably 4 months or so to get it done. And it can come out of the port's budget, or we can take it out of the program budget, since it's coming up as a consequence of the program. I have no problem taking it out of the port's budget.
So I would have guessed a little bit less on the cost, but that the port was going to pay. But whether the port pays from the project or the port, you tell us. That's the first step. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, and then just one follow-up. So you mentioned about demand, and I know it's hard to project out very far in the future, but I'm also thinking just about the impacts of climate change long term. Because I know, for example, the city of Chicago is projecting, very long term, decades from now, a much larger population because they have a large source of fresh water, they have a temperate climate, and there will be people coming from the coasts that move there. And I know that maybe sounds extreme, but I think we're seeing these effects in real time. And so I just want to put on the table, I think not that we should overbuild. I think Mr. Volan's point is a good one, but that we're assuming a stable population. And I don't know that that's necessarily true for decades from now. And then I also am curious, what is the industry long-term projections? And I think that needs to be included in the economic analysis, because I know industries, certainly large infrastructure-based industries, do look decades in advance and are very sophisticated in their own projections. I know, for example, the cruise industry, makes projections every year. So I just wondered what they're saying now about the next 50 years and if that can be included in that analysis. Thank you.
Oh, it certainly can be included. And I didn't mean to give you the impression that nothing's going to change between now and the future. I can just speak to what I've experienced for the last 16 years. And sometimes what's going to happen tomorrow is kind of what happened today. But when you're going out, into the future, that's why these folks are experts at what they do. Our goal, to Mr. Volan's point, our goal is to keep them from getting too optimistic.
The only part of your statement that I might take objection to is Chicago in the summer being described as temperate. Having been there, Ms. Alatel.
Thank you. To this issue of kind of the economic analysis and not projecting too far, we're in phase 2B, which is the cargo docks. It's projected from 2025 to 2032. It's not a terribly long time horizon, 9 years or less. And that brings me to the question, what right now is the projected Terminal 2 construction start date?
Near the end of 2028, beginning of 2029.
Great, thank you. I think that's helpful as we look at the timing of the various terminals. And then I guess I would just say, I feel like our story about the port started afresh once we got the PCT up and going. We showed we could do it. We actually have Northeast stabilization in the admin building moving forward with federal and state dollars. So, I actually think that there's really an optimistic story to tell about the port right now. And I think it's part of our job to make sure we're doing that. So thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to add one more, if I may, and just to pat the port and Jacob's guys on the back. With respect to the PCT, we built a $225 million facility that's only costing $19 million. Because that's all we had to borrow to close the gap.
Costing us.
I'd kill if half of that is what happens on the cargo docks.
So Steve, that raises another question. So on the tariff, Ms. Alatel and I were having some discussions about what do those dollars buy? The 19 is easy to understand because we spent it. I think it's 65. Is that the difference, or is it 48? And 19, it makes 65. What is that going to buy?
65.
It's the 65 in revenue bonds.
I'll give Ross a chance to answer it. I, off the top of my head, can say very generally, additional for the designer of record, there'll be some additional work there, and I think for the next few years, and why we're just looking for the capability to get the bonds. I can't think of anything in the next few years that is a requirement for 65 million. But Eric, if you can, I'll take your word for it.
I would have to defer to Ross. I don't have exactly memorized what was in his $65 million request for the bond package. I can talk about upcoming projects. I just don't know exactly which one ties that bond package for the $65 million.
Which
Mr. Adams, this is Ross Griswold. The the plan of finance is for the entire PAMP, as everyone can imagine and knows. When we come to needing the particular phases and the particular projects within a phase, they are subject to construction contracts that are, and those construction contracts look for, when they let those contracts, they look for unencumbered budget. So it's the unencumbered budget of the port that provides the source of funds for particular projects. For example, Terminal 1 is, from my understanding, it's approximately $600 million that we might need at some time in the near future to let a construction contract for that. Now, the unencumbered budget in SAP for the port's capital account is made up of a variety of items, including revenue bonds, including state of Alaska funds, federal grants, and so forth. So a particular revenue bond isn't necessarily associated with a piece of the project. Now, without going into too much detail, there are some grants that will be very specific that says this grant is for, let's say, for example, we'll give you this grant because we know you need a new administration building and you can only use it for the administration building. So we always make sure that those grant monies pay for specific items under the, for the construction of the administration building. But when it comes to the revenue bonds, they are designed and worded such in the ordinances and in the bond offerings to investors that those monies can be used for the PAMP as cash is needed. Once, and again, as Steve and others have pointed out, we use the least expensive money first, and that money creates the money, or the commitment to receive money creates unencumbered budget, and that's what we need to let a contract. Does that help?
Right. Okay, so that leads to the next question then. We aren't appropriating for expenditures these dollars, right? We're just authorizing the securing of the capital.
When it's ready.
Mr. Khan, what dollars are you referring to?
The 65 million of the revenue bonds we're talking about issuing, we're not moving towards appropriation of those dollars, right? What I'm concerned about is, are we effectively authorizing the expense of $65 million without a known expenditure?
No, you're not. And we talked a little bit today about process.
Right.
This is another one of the upsides of getting this into the tariff. To make a change to the rate structure in the tariff requires we first go to the Port Commission. The Port Commission makes a recommendation to the Assembly, who eventually approves it. So even if we have the authorization to spend those dollars, we won't go out and sell the bonds until we specifically have an amount required to do something, run that past the Port Commission for their approval, because with it's going to come a change to the surcharge rates to cover this additional debt. And then it comes to the Assembly for approval. So we can't spend anything without your approval, because we can't change the rates without your approval. And I'm hoping that's.
So we have a follow-up question from Ms. Zalatil.
I don't think that's quite right under AO 2023-34, because what's presented in the surcharge and the uniform tariff and surcharge is authorization to borrow the $65 million plus restructure the $19 million in debt. So it's already gone to the Port Commission to do this. And so here's where I'm at with this, and why I would like to wait is because we don't have a very clear identified purpose for the $65 million right now. Is why would we pay to issue those bonds? Why would we finance money and be paying a finance charge when we don't have identified need for money right now? when we've already are going to be authorizing with we already will have authorized with the $19 million in restructured debt, a surcharge concept. So you could bring back another surcharge when you're ready to actually issue the revenue bonds for a specific purpose. To me, it makes no sense to issue revenue bonds, which are not the cheapest dollars, to just have it in case you need it. It doesn't preclude it from potentially happening, but what's before us would authorize you to go ahead and sell those bonds and get going with the surcharge to start paying the cost of those bonds. Thanks.
Well, I like your number 2, your line number 2 on the tariff page there. It sounds like a substitute version of the AO, which speaks only to the 19 million, is called for.
That's my plan.
Well, and we just got to put pen to paper, because there's no objection on this side here to that.
So if I might, getting to Ross's point, I think what I heard him say was effectively it's there for liquidity purposes. Like, so if we have a need liquid capital for various elements, but those projects would still have to come before us, right?
Yes,
And so if that's the case, then I'm okay probably either way, as long as we're not actually going to the bond market and securing the bonds until we have the need that's identified. And so I could go either way, but I appreciate the leadership Ms. Zalatel has provided in helping frame this conversation in a way that gets us over the hurdles that have
Yeah.
been blocking us for months.
agreed.
And so whatever that final version turns out to be, I think we're getting close enough to an adoptable project.
And the hook with the surcharge being in the tariff is that we can't change the tariff without the Assembly's approval. And in the tariff is the surcharge, and we can't change the surcharge without the Assembly's approval. So everything we do related to the reason behind wanting to raise the surcharge rates has to come to the Assembly. So there's no way for us to get anything past you without you having seen it and talked about it.
Yeah, it's hard. Sometimes we end up at the end of a conversation where our counsel tells us, oh no, with this one action you did a year ago, that money's been appropriated and it's theirs to spend. And that isn't a you thing, that's a overall
Yeah.
process thing. It's raised a number of questions for us.
You made us incredibly sensitive to that point.
Yeah.
So we'll be careful, we will really be careful. And I think this is the one thing that keeps us from getting out in front of our skis.
Okay, so are there other questions? I think that I'll just end this work session by saying thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Oh, wait, maybe, hold on.
And if we have any homework assignments, let me know, so that we can get on those before Tuesday.
So again, I heard you say just now, Steve, that all of these project elements are going to come before us, that you aren't going to get in front of your skis, to use a term that I appreciate because I ski. If we approve the surcharge above $19 million, would those dollars be there for you to spend?
Mr. Constant?
Mr. Riswald?
Thank you, sir. You, a moment ago, you were exactly right in your thought process, thinking aloud. Excuse me. The surcharge that is proposed in item number 272, that new item number, that surcharge would provide revenue for the $19 million that is currently outstanding, and it would provide the required revenue for a $65 million bond issue in the event that we sold that. That would cover that. Now, we don't plan on selling that until we cash. And this ordinance doesn't authorize any additional bond or authorization. What I have provided to Mr. Thurn is he has a document that were you to want to split off the $65 million from the item 272 and leave it just at $19 million, he has those numbers. Alden does.
Mr. Risvold, can I briefly interrupt you and ask, what is this document 272 you're referring to? I
No.
don't think we have it.
No, I, don't- I think, yeah, and I think what he's referring to is in the tariff, the surcharge will be item number 272
Got it.
in part 2 of the
Okay,
tariff.
thank you. Exhibit,
Mr.
please.
Thompson, I think I'm on page 50 of the document.
Understood.
And it's in yellow, whole page is in yellow.
Yep.
And that's item 272. I refer to that because that's, every line item in the document has an item number. So if the assembly would want to reduce the surcharge to the $19 million only, Alden Thurn has those numbers and he's prepared to use them. Now, if you change it to $19 million, you will effectively be charging exactly the same amount that you're charging now in current tariff 9.1. The only difference is the tariff is formatted a little differently with the added item number 272 on page 50. So the surcharge that you're charging would be exactly the same as what you're charging right now.
Ms. Alto?
Thank you. That's a great explanation. I think what it does, though, is it invokes the surcharge concept. And from a policymaking perspective, that's really important because it's the uniform tariff and it invokes the surcharge. If we were to leave the $65 million, if we were to approve the item as presented before us, Mr. Risvold, on January 1, which is the current effective date, would a surcharge go in effect for the entire $80 million, regardless if you had issued the revenue bonds?
Through the chair, Ms. Zalatoff, that's a good question. Thank you for that. If the way the surcharge ordinance is written right now, it would support $84 million of debt, the 65 plus the outstanding 19. It will go into effect. The cover page says effective April 1st, 2023. That's gone, of course. So it's really up to to decide what date it could go into effect. We've proposed perhaps January 1st, 2024. Now, there's no reason why you can't make it any other date.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to make sure I just kind of need a yes or no. So if we approve the ordinance before us for the $84 million in debt service and the tariff goes into effect, which is proposed for January 1, 2024 in the ordinance, the full surcharge, the surcharge will be to service the entire $84 million of debt, correct? Regardless of whether or not the additional revenue bonds are issued.
Yes.
Thank you.
Chewing on that for a minute. Mr. Bowman?
Thank you. Through the chair to Assemblymember Zalatoff, I believe what Ross was implying though was with the currently written AO, the surcharge numbers account for the $84 million of debt, but he has provided new numbers such that we could take the currently written AO and just swap out the new numbers so that the surcharge only supports $19 million of debt, and therefore if there was to be a subsequent change where we seek that the full amount of the debt, we would have to come back to the assembly, redo the tariff, redo those numbers. So we could do a relatively simple change to the tariff AO, adjusting just those numbers, and then the surcharge would not support the full value, it would only support the 19.
I would generally agree with you, Mr. Bowman, but at line 37, I don't know if we're still okay saying supported by the Port Commission resolution at Exhibit A, because it's different from what the Port Commission passed. And I also really do want to make sure we put some language in here committing to the surcharge concept around TIFIA loan financing. So whether or not we do that via amendment or substitute version, you and I could probably work together.
So, but that raises a whole other question. But I think it's maybe a good thing. I don't know if it's legal or legitimate because I'm not a port expert, finance expert. So we talk about the cheapest money possible. as the funding that we want, which obviously the first is other people's money, and then our money, and then our money based on however we secure those funds. And so what happens if we authorize the uniform tariff surcharge at $80 million and just start collecting?
I know Ross has got a very technical answer to this, but the intent is to capture that money in some kind of a program to be used solely for this purpose.
Right.
And remember, we said we would come back every year and review everything that has been done, what's been collected, what changes we might be able to make to the surcharge because we have too much money or not enough. I mean, those, all of that we will execute. But I know that we have a concern, and I know the users have a concern that this is going to be an incredible amount of money that other people are going to look at and want to use for other things. So
Okay.
I think the CFO's office is looking at a way to fence it. So this is the purpose that it's for. It's unavailable for anything but.
So if we had a substantial cash pool with restrictions sufficient to protect the corpus until needed, does that threaten securing federal grants?
I don't think so.
Right?
It
If you have
shouldn't.
too much money in the
No,
bank, maybe they're
no,
like, you don't really need
I don't
this.
think they're going to punish us for being thrifty. We can still go after grants. There is no need.
You
There's
don't
no
have to
need
be in
there's
poverty.
no need requirement for federal grants. Yeah.
Okay, well, there's so much to chew on there, y'all. And I know a lot of folks haven't said anything because it's highly complex and technical information, but it's so important. It's really close to our number one job. Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, just kind of on that subject, if we're talking about going ahead with the surcharge, but not necessarily committing that money towards the $65 million in bonding, just to make sure it's on the record and I have the sense of scale correct here, we'd be talking about roughly $7 million in revenue from the additional surcharge. Is that about right?
I don't have that number handy. It sounds familiar though.
Alden is nodding his head. Yes. That's the annual basis. Yeah.
Mr. Constant, this is Mr. Risvold.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir. The required revenue for supporting the $19 million outstanding and that forecasted $65 million of debt that we forecast would be the next perhaps debt issue. The annual revenue is approximately $7.2 million to support both of those. Now, I would say that sort of in summary here, I think the assembly members here are suggesting that we're going to move forward with the uniform surcharge, and we're also going to implement a surcharge concept, which is this new item in the tariff, and that's a very beneficial thing for everybody here, the users, the investors, TIFIA, and the port here and the administration. It's a good thing for us to put into place. We certainly acknowledge that, yes, we would be, it could be argued that we're over collecting because we don't have the $65 million outstanding. But what we intend to do is all the money that's collected for the surcharge for the port would be put in a separate cost center in SAP and readily identifiable, and it would be restricted for the use of just paying debt service on the debt. And the second use would be, yes, there would be more money collected than needed, because remember, we have a debt service coverage ratio of 1.35 times debt service that we need to collect. So there will be additional amounts generated in this cost center. At some point in time, what we would do is we'll take that money and put it in a Port of Alaska Reconstruction Investment Fund, so that we'll have money in the future to rebuild the port in 50 to 75 years. Now, we didn't do that in 1950, but that's hindsight. but it's a similar concept to what we're doing with Anchorage Regional Landfill. We're collecting revenues from users and we're putting it in a investment to close the landfill in 20, 30, or 40 years, whatever happens, and to operate post-closure requirements under EPA and DEC rules. It would be the same concept, but we were going to restrict, our intent is to restrict all of this money that's collected from the surcharge to debt service only and perhaps this reconstruction fund.
Yeah, we're down to about 5 minutes. Ms. Zalato.
Thank you. If we authorize the surcharge to cover the full $84 million, is there any additional assembly authorization you need in order to issue the $65 million in revenue bonds?
Through the chair, no, there isn't, because we do have authorization for revenue bonds that we have not issued, and it's in excess of $65 million. So there would not be, there would not be any additional authorization or approval from the assembly needed to need to sell bonds, but we certainly would keep you apprised of our activities with regard to the port. Now, Cynthia Weed is our bond counsel, and I might ask her to confirm what I have just said. Cynthia?
I'll take your word for it. I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that actually results in a blank check, which I don't think is the ideal situation. So we have to chew on that a little bit more over the weekend, but I also don't think that changes the fact that we have come remarkably close to a decision point that has general agreement. And so if there are no last questions or comments, we'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you, everybody.